Alex, you're such a disappointment. I don't know where we went wrong with you. Those words cut through the dinner table conversation like a knife through warm butter. My mother, Patricia Rivera, said it with the same casual tone she used to ask someone to pass the salt. The entire family went quiet, forks suspended mid-bite, waiting to see how I'd react. They'd all heard her say it before, but never quite so bluntly in front of everyone. What they didn't know was that Agent Sarah Mitchell was standing just outside the sliding glass door, listening to every word. And in about 30 seconds, their comfortable little world was about to get turned completely upside down. My name is Alex Rivera, and if you've ever been the family scapegoat who became something they never imagined possible, this story is for you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The thing about being the family disappointment is that it becomes your identity before you even realize what's happening. Growing up in Riverside, California, in our modest ranch house on Maple Street, I learned early that I didn't fit the Rivera family mold. My older brother Marcus was the athlete, the charmer, the one who could fix cars with Dad and sweet-talk Mom into anything. My younger sister Sophie was the social butterfly, the cheerleader, the one who brought home boyfriends that made my parents beam with pride. And then there was me, the one who preferred books to baseball, who asked too many questions at dinner, who wanted to talk about current events instead of the latest episode of whatever reality show was trending. I was the one who got decent grades but not spectacular ones, who joined debate club instead of football, who spent Friday nights at the library instead of parties. In the Rivera household, I was the square peg they kept trying to hammer into a round hole. "Why can't you be more like Marcus?" became my mother's favorite refrain. When Marcus scored the winning touchdown, when Marcus got the scholarship offer, when Marcus landed his first job at Rivera Family Construction right after high school. "Why can't you just be normal like Sophie?" She'd sigh when Sophie would come home with stories of her latest social conquest, or when she'd bring home another trophy from some beauty pageant or cheerleading competition. The pattern started early and never stopped. When I expressed interest in going to college, Dad scoffed and said, "College is for people who can't handle real work." When I got accepted to UC Riverside, Mom shrugged and said, "Well, at least it's close to home so you can't mess up too badly." When I graduated with honors and talked about going to graduate school, Uncle Tony actually laughed at the dinner table and said, "More school? When are you going to start living in the real world?" But it was the Christmas dinner of 2018 that really sealed my fate as the family disappointment. I had just finished my master's degree and was talking about the job offer I'd received in Washington, D.C. The entire family was gathered around Mom's perfectly set dining room table, the good china gleaming under the chandelier Dad had installed the year before. Marcus was there with his wife Jennifer and their 2 kids. Sophie had brought her fiancé Derek, and Uncle Tony and Aunt Carmen had driven over from their house across town with their kids Danny and Lisa. I was excited to share my news. I thought maybe, finally, they'd be proud of me. I'd worked so hard, studied so much, and this opportunity felt like validation of everything I'd been working toward. But when I started explaining the position, the government work, the security clearance requirements, the move to the nation's capital, I watched their faces change, from mild interest to confusion to something that looked almost like disgust. "Government work?" Mom said, setting down her wine glass a little too hard. "Alex, that's not a real career. That's just bureaucracy. Paper pushing. When are you going to do something meaningful with your life?" Marcus jumped in, always ready to play the supportive big brother role that made him look good. "Come on, Alex, you've got a good brain. Why waste it working for politicians? Why don't you come work for the family business? Dad's been saying he could use someone to handle the books, maybe help with bidding on some of the bigger contracts." The suggestion hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Work for Rivera Family Construction, filing papers and answering phones, watching Marcus take over as Dad's successor while I became the family bookkeeper. The safe choice. The expected choice. The choice that would keep me close to home where they could continue to manage my disappointing life choices. "I appreciate the offer," I said carefully, But this is a real opportunity. The work I'd be doing is important. It's classified, so I can't go into details, but it's meaningful work that could make a real difference. Uncle Tony snorted. Classified? What are you, some kind of spy now? Alex, you watch too many movies. Government work is about as exciting as watching paint dry. The laughter that followed felt like a slap. Even Sophie giggled, though she tried to hide it behind her napkin. Dad just shook his head and went back to carving the ham, and Mom got that look on her face, the one that said she was about to deliver one of her pronouncements. Honestly, Alex, I sometimes wonder if you're just afraid of real responsibility, running away to Washington like some kind of adventure. When are you going to settle down, find a nice girl, start a family, contribute something meaningful to the world instead of chasing these fantasies? That was the moment I realized it didn't matter what I achieved or how hard I worked. In their eyes, I would always be the disappointment, the one who couldn't quite measure up to their expectations, the one who made choices they didn't understand and therefore couldn't value. I finished dinner in silence, helped clean up like the good son I'd always tried to be, and left for Washington 2 weeks later. The first few years in D.C. were harder than I'd expected, but not for the reasons my family had predicted. The work itself was challenging and rewarding in ways I'd never imagined. I was part of something bigger than myself, contributing to national security in ways that most people would never know about but that kept them safe every single day. The learning curve was steep, the hours were long, and the responsibility was enormous, but I thrived in a way I never had before. I found mentors who saw potential in me instead of disappointment. I worked alongside brilliant people who valued my analytical mind and my attention to detail. I discovered that the qualities my family had always seen as weaknesses, my caution, my tendency to ask questions, my preference for thinking before acting, were actually strengths in this environment. But the hardest part wasn't the work, it was the silence from home, the phone calls that gradually became less frequent, the holidays I spent alone because the flights were too expensive, and the welcome felt increasingly lukewarm. When I did call home, the conversations were stilted and superficial. Mom would ask if I was still doing that government thing, as if it were a phase I'd eventually outgrow. Dad would grunt his way through updates about the business, making it clear that real work was happening in Riverside while I was playing dress-up in Washington. Marcus got married, bought a house 3 blocks from our parents, took over more responsibilities at the construction company. Sophie finished college, got engaged to Derek, who worked in real estate, and started planning the kind of wedding that would be the talk of Riverside for months. And I was the absent brother, the one who sent nice gifts but couldn't be bothered to come home for the important moments. Except that wasn't the whole truth. I wanted to come home, I wanted to be part of their lives, to share in their celebrations, to have them understand, and maybe even be proud of what I was building. But every time I tried to explain my work, to share my excitement about a project or a promotion, I could see their eyes glaze over. It was like speaking a foreign language to people who had no interest in learning. The breaking point came in 2021. I had just been promoted to a position that came with a significant security upgrade. The kind of role that maybe a dozen people in the entire country were qualified for. It was the culmination of everything I'd been working toward, and I was bursting to share the news with someone who mattered to me. So I called home. Mom answered the phone with her usual distracted tone, already half-focused on whatever dinner she was preparing. I could hear the TV in the background, Dad watching his evening news, the familiar sounds of the house I'd grown up in but no longer quite belonged to. "Hi, Mom, it's Alex. I have some really exciting news to share." "Oh, that's nice, honey. Hold on, let me turn down the TV." "Bob, Alex is on the phone." I heard the volume decrease and some shuffling as she settled into her favorite chair. "Okay, what's your news?" I took a deep breath, preparing to share what felt like the biggest moment of my professional life. I got promoted. It's a really significant role, Mom. I can't go into all the details because of security restrictions, but it's the kind of position that means I'm really making a difference. The work I'm doing now affects national policy, and I'm working directly with some of the most important people in government. There was a pause that stretched longer than it should have, and then Mom sighed. "That's nice, Alex. I'm sure it's very important to you. Are you making more money?" Because Marcus just got another big contract for the business, and Sophie and Derek just put an offer on the cutest house near the shopping center. The deflation I felt was immediate and complete. Here I was, trying to share what was genuinely one of the most significant achievements of my life, and she'd responded like I'd told her I'd gotten a new coffee maker. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, perfunctory updates about family members, weather, and local gossip, before she had to go because Dad wanted dinner. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment overlooking the Potomac, surrounded by the artifacts of a life they couldn't understand or value, and made a decision. I stopped trying to make them proud. I stopped calling with updates about my work. I stopped hoping they'd eventually see me as successful in my own right, rather than just different from what they wanted me to be. For 3 years, our relationship existed on the surface level of birthday cards and Christmas gifts, brief phone calls that covered weather and family gossip but nothing deeper. I built a life in Washington that was fulfilling and meaningful, surrounded by colleagues who respected my work and friends who understood the demands of my career. I dated a fellow analyst named Rachel for 2 years, someone who got excited about my promotions and understood why I couldn't always talk about my day. I bought a condo, adopted a rescue dog named Charlie, and created the kind of life that felt authentically mine for the first time. But underneath it all, there was still that kid from Maple Street who wanted his family to see him, really see him, and be proud of who he'd become. That's the thing about family disappointment. It leaves a mark that success can heal but never quite erase completely. Which brings us to last month. To the phone call that changed everything. It was a Tuesday evening, and I was reviewing briefing materials for a meeting the next morning when my phone rang. Mom's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. These calls had become predictable. Someone was getting married or having a baby or celebrating an anniversary, and I was expected to express the appropriate enthusiasm for milestones in lives I'd become increasingly disconnected from. But something made me answer. Maybe it was the time of day, since Mom rarely called after dinner. Or maybe it was intuition, but I picked up on the third ring. "Hi, Mom. Alex." Her voice was brighter than usual, with an excitement that immediately put me on alert. "I'm so glad you answered. I have wonderful news. We're planning a big family dinner this Saturday to celebrate Dad's 60th birthday, and I really want you to come home for it. It's been too long since we've all been together." I glanced at my calendar, automatically calculating flights and timing, while a part of my brain wondered why this particular birthday required my presence when the last several hadn't. "Saturday? That's pretty short notice, Mom. I'd have to check my schedule, see if I can get a flight." "Oh, please try, Alex. It would mean so much to your father. Marcus is bringing the whole family. Sophie and Derek will be there. Uncle Tony and Aunt Carmen are coming, with Danny and Lisa. It's going to be such a nice celebration, and it won't be the same without you." There was something in her tone, a kind of forced cheerfulness that suggested this invitation was about more than Dad's birthday. But I found myself saying yes anyway, promising to check flights and get back to her, agreeing to come home for the first time in over a year. What I couldn't tell her, was that my life had changed in ways she couldn't imagine. The promotion I'd mentioned 3 years ago had led to another promotion, and then another, each one bringing increased responsibility and heightened security measures. The work I did now required a level of protection that most people only saw in movies, the kind of security detail that came with serious people who took their job of keeping me alive very seriously. Agent Sarah Mitchell had been my primary protection for 8 months now, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Secret Service agent, with 15 years of experience, and the kind of calm competence that made dangerous situations feel manageable. Agent James Thompson was her partner, a former Marine with a dry sense of humor and an uncanny ability to blend into any environment. Together, they formed a security team that had become as much a part of my daily routine as my morning coffee. The conversation about the family dinner was going to be interesting. How do you explain to highly trained federal agents that they need to accompany you to your parents' house in Riverside, California, for a birthday celebration with people who think you work a boring desk job in Washington? How do you brief them on a family that sees you as their greatest disappointment while maintaining the operational security that keeps everyone safe? But Agent Mitchell had handled stranger assignments, and when I explained the situation the next morning, she simply nodded and started asking practical questions. How many people would be there? What was the layout of the house? Would we be eating inside or outside? Were there any family members with criminal backgrounds or restraining orders? Her thoroughness was both comforting and surreal. Here was someone taking my safety seriously enough to run background checks on my Uncle Tony, while Uncle Tony himself probably still thought I was filing paperwork somewhere in a government basement. The flight to LAX was routine, the kind of careful travel that had become second nature. Mitchell and Thompson flanked me through security, their credentials smoothing the way past checkpoints and onto the plane. To anyone watching, we might have looked like business associates traveling together, certainly nothing that would draw attention or suggest anything unusual about the quiet man in the middle seat who spent the flight reviewing what looked like ordinary paperwork. But as we descended into Los Angeles, as the familiar landscape of Southern California spread out below us, I felt a knot forming in my stomach that had nothing to do with turbulence. It had been over a year since I'd been home, and while I'd changed in ways my family couldn't imagine, they had remained exactly the same. Same house, same jobs, same expectations, same disappointment in the son who'd chosen a life they couldn't understand. The rental car was a black SUV, the kind of vehicle that suggested business travel rather than family visits. Mitchell drove while Thompson maintained communication with their support team, a level of coordination that felt both protective and isolating. As we made our way through familiar neighborhoods toward Maple Street, I found myself seeing Riverside through their eyes. Potential threats, escape routes, sightlines, all the tactical considerations that had nothing to do with the emotional minefield I was about to walk into. "Sir," Mitchell said as we turned onto my parents' street, "remember that we'll be maintaining visual contact throughout the evening. If you need us, any signal will bring us immediately. Try to enjoy your family time, but stay aware of your surroundings. Enjoy my family time. If only it were that simple." As we pulled up in front of the house where I'd grown up, I could see cars already filling the driveway and lining the street. Marcus's truck, Sophie's little Honda, Uncle Tony's sedan. The whole gang was here, ready to celebrate Dad's milestone birthday and probably ready to remind me once again how little I fit into their version of success. Mitchell and Thompson would remain outside, invisible but present, while I walked back into a world that had never quite known what to do with me. What my family didn't realize was that the disappointed son they'd always struggled to understand had become someone whose life required federal protection, whose work influenced national policy, whose very presence in their little suburban bubble was about to change everything they thought they knew about Alex Rivera. Walking up the familiar concrete path to my childhood home felt like stepping through a time machine, except I was the only thing that had fundamentally changed. The house looked exactly the same, Mom's carefully maintained flower beds, Dad's workshop light visible through the garage window, the porch swing where Sophie used to sit talking on the phone for hours during high school. Even the doormat was the same, a cheerful welcome friends message that had always felt more aspirational than accurate where I was concerned. I could hear voices and laughter spilling out from the backyard before I even reached the front door. The sound of my family celebrating, enjoying each other's company in the easy way that had always seemed just slightly out of reach for me. For a moment, standing there with my hand raised to knock, I almost turned around. Agent Mitchell was positioned near the SUV, and I knew that one word from me would abort this entire mission and have us back on a plane to DC within hours. But something kept me moving forward. Maybe it was curiosity about whether anything had changed. Or maybe it was that stubborn part of me that had never quite given up hope that someday they'd see me differently. Either way, I knocked. Mom answered the door wearing her favorite apron, the one with little roosters on it that she'd had for at least 15 years. Her face lit up with genuine surprise and pleasure, and for a moment she looked exactly like the mother I remembered from childhood, before disappointment in me had become her default expression. "Alex, oh my goodness, you actually came!" She pulled me into a hug that smelled like vanilla and the same perfume she'd worn my entire life. "I wasn't sure you'd make it. Come in, come in. Everyone's out back. Your father is going to be so surprised." The house was exactly as I remembered it. Family photos crowding every surface. Mom's collection of ceramic angels watching from their shelf. the slight creak in the hallway floor that had announced my teenage attempts at sneaking in past curfew. But now I was seeing it all through the lens of someone whose life had become something entirely different. I found myself automatically noting sightlines and exit points, the kind of tactical awareness that had become second nature. "Is everything all right, honey?" Mom asked, noticing my hesitation. "You seem a little tense." "Just tired from the flight," I said, which wasn't entirely untrue. "Long day." She nodded sympathetically and ushered me toward the sliding glass doors that led to the backyard. "Well, you can relax now. It's just family, and we have so much catching up to do. I made your favorite potato salad, and Marcus brought that beer you used to like in college." Through the glass, I could see the whole Rivera clan assembled around the picnic table Dad had built when I was 12. Uncle Tony was manning the grill, a beer in one hand and a spatula in the other, holding court about something that was making everyone laugh. Aunt Carmen was setting out dishes on the folding table Mom always used for outdoor gatherings, while their kids Danny and Lisa were playing some kind of game with Marcus's children near the fence. Marcus himself was sitting in Dad's favorite lawn chair, still wearing his work clothes from the construction site, looking every inch the successful son who'd followed the expected path. Sophie was perched on the picnic table bench next to Derek, both of them scrolling through their phones and occasionally showing each other something that made them giggle. And Dad was standing near the back fence, examining his tomato plants with the serious attention he'd always reserved for things that actually mattered to him. The scene was so perfectly, stereotypically normal that it made my chest tight. This was the family life I'd grown up in, the one I'd never quite figured out how to be part of, and now I was about to walk into it carrying secrets that would fundamentally change how they saw everything. "Surprise!" Mom called out as she slid the door open. "Look who decided to join us!" The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Marcus jumped up from his chair with a genuine grin that reminded me why I'd idolized him as a kid, despite everything. "Alex! Holy shit, I can't believe you're here!" He crossed the yard in 3 quick strides and pulled me into one of his bone-crushing hugs. "When's the last time you were home?" "Has to be over a year." "Closer to 2, I admitted, accepting hugs from Sophie and Aunt Carmen while Dad made his way over from the garden. 2 years. Uncle Tony shook his head while flipping a burger. "Damn, Alex, what's keeping you so busy in Washington that you can't visit your family?" It was exactly the kind of question I'd been dreading, the casual inquiry that had no casual answer. How do you explain to people who think government work means filing paperwork that your schedule is dictated by national security concerns and congressional briefing cycles? How do you tell your uncle who runs a small electrical business that you can't always travel freely because your movements require coordination with federal protection details? "Work keeps me pretty busy," I said, accepting a beer from Marcus and hoping the conversation would move on to safer topics. "You know how it is." But Dad had reached us by then, and he was studying me with the same careful attention he'd been giving his tomatoes. Robert Rivera had always been a man of few words, but he noticed everything. He was seeing something different about me, I could tell, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. "You look good, son," he said finally, pulling me into a brief, awkward hug. "Different somehow. More." He paused, searching for the word. "Serious, I guess. Very serious." It was probably the most insightful thing Dad had ever said about me, and it caught me off guard. I did feel more serious, more substantial somehow, than the uncertain young man who'd left Riverside all those years ago. The work I did now, the responsibility I carried, the decisions I was part of making, they had weight in a way that nothing in my previous life ever had. "Thanks, Dad. Happy birthday, by the way. 60 looks good on you." He grunted in the way that meant he was pleased but didn't know how to express it, and the moment passed into the comfortable chaos of family gathering. Questions flew at me from all directions. Was I still doing that government thing? Had I met anyone special? When was I going to settle down? Did I miss California? Was I making good money? Each question felt like a small probe, family members trying to understand a life that had become foreign to them. I found myself giving the same vague answers I'd been giving for years, deflecting specific questions about my work with general statements about public service and administrative responsibilities. It wasn't lying, exactly, but it wasn't the truth either. The truth was that the work I did now was classified at levels that would require security clearances, just to discuss. That my daily routine involved briefings on matters of national importance. That the decisions I influenced affected millions of people in ways they'd never know about. But how do you explain that to people who see government work as bureaucratic dead weight? How do you tell your family that the disappointment they'd written off had become someone whose opinion mattered in rooms where policy was made and history was shaped? The dinner conversation flowed around familiar topics: Marcus's latest construction projects, Sophie's wedding planning, Uncle Tony's theories about everything wrong with the world, Aunt Carmen's updates on neighborhood gossip. I found myself settling into old patterns, listening more than talking, observing the family dynamics that had shaped my childhood and ultimately driven me away. Marcus was still clearly the golden child, the one whose opinions carried weight and whose achievements were celebrated without question. When he talked about landing a big commercial contract, everyone leaned in with genuine interest and pride. When Sophie showed off the engagement ring Derek had given her, the table erupted in excitement and demands to see photos of the venue they'd chosen. And when the conversation occasionally turned to me, I could feel the subtle shift in energy, polite interest rather than genuine enthusiasm. Questions that felt more like obligations than curiosity. The familiar sense that I was the family member they loved because they had to, not because they truly understood or valued who I'd become. It was during the main course, as we were all digging into Dad's grilled burgers and Mom's famous potato salad, that the conversation took the turn I'd been dreading. "So, Alex," Uncle Tony said, setting down his beer and giving me that look that meant he was about to deliver one of his lectures. "I've been thinking about our conversation a few years ago, about you working for the government and all. I'm curious, what exactly do you do all day? Because I've got to tell you, from where I sit, it seems like the government is more screwed up than ever. What are you people actually accomplishing over there?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I could feel everyone's attention focusing on me. This was the moment I'd been avoiding for years, the direct confrontation about the value and meaning of my work. Uncle Tony wasn't trying to be malicious, I knew that. He genuinely couldn't understand why someone would choose a career in government service when there were real jobs available in the private sector. "I work in analysis and policy development," I said carefully, sticking to the same vague description I'd been using for years. "It's mostly research and recommendations, briefing papers, that sort of thing." "Briefing papers for who?" Marcus asked, and I could hear genuine curiosity in his voice rather than Uncle Tony's skepticism. "Like who reads the stuff you write?" Quote. It was such a simple question, and the honest answer would have changed everything. The briefing papers I wrote were read by cabinet secretaries, senior military leadership, congressional committee chairs, and occasionally by the president himself. The analysis I provided influenced decisions about everything from defense spending to international trade agreements. The recommendations I developed helped shape policies that affected millions of Americans and billions of people around the world. But I couldn't say any of that, not without revealing the true nature and scope of my work. So I gave another vague answer about senior officials and decision-makers, watching as their eyes glazed over with the familiar look of people who were trying to be polite about something they couldn't understand or relate to. "Well, that sounds very important," Mom said in the tone she used when she was trying to be supportive but wasn't really convinced. "I'm sure you're doing valuable work, honey." The patronizing kindness in her voice was almost worse than Uncle Tony's open skepticism. At least he was being honest about his doubts. Mom was trying to be encouraging about something she fundamentally didn't believe mattered, and the effort was more painful than helpful. "It is important," I said, and for the first time that evening, there was an edge to my voice that made everyone look up from their plates. "More important than you realize." Dad raised an eyebrow at my tone, and I could see Marcus and Sophie exchanging glances. I'd never pushed back against their dismissive attitude before, never insisted on the value of my work or demanded that they take it seriously. For years I'd accepted their benign neglect and gentle mockery because it was easier than fighting a battle I couldn't win without revealing information I wasn't allowed to share. But something about being back in this familiar setting, surrounded by people who thought they knew me but had no idea who I'd become, was making it harder to maintain the careful neutrality I'd practiced for so long. "I'm sure it is, son," Dad said in his diplomatic voice, the one he used when he was trying to diffuse tension without taking sides. "We're proud of you for finding work that means something to you." It was such a perfectly reasonable thing to say, and it made me want to scream. They were proud of me for finding work that meant something to me, as if my career were a hobby I'd picked up to keep myself occupied. They had no idea that the work I did kept people safe, that the policies I helped develop protected American interests around the world, that the analysis I provided helped prevent conflicts that could cost thousands of lives. "Thanks, Dad," I managed, taking a long drink of beer and trying to reset my emotional equilibrium. This was exactly why I'd stopped coming home, why phone calls had become perfunctory exchanges of basic information. Every conversation was a reminder that the most important parts of my life were invisible to the people who were supposed to know me best. The conversation moved on to safer topics after that, but I could feel the subtle shift in dynamics. They'd noticed my reaction, the way I'd defended my work with an intensity they hadn't expected. For the first time, I think they were starting to realize that there might be more to my life in Washington than they'd assumed. Uncle Tony started telling a story about a difficult client at his electrical business, and everyone settled back into the comfortable rhythm of family storytelling. But I noticed Dad watching me with a thoughtful expression, and Marcus kept glancing in my direction like he was seeing me differently than he had before. Sophie was the first to directly address the change she was sensing. During a lull in the conversation, while Mom was clearing plates and getting ready to bring out Dad's birthday cake, she scooted closer to me on the picnic bench. "Alex, can I ask you something?" Her voice was quieter than usual, lacking the casual confidence that had always characterized her interactions with me. "Are you okay? You seem different tonight. More, I don't know, intense? Like something's bothering you." It was such a thoughtful question, and it reminded me that despite our different paths in life, Sophie had always been more observant than people gave her credit for. She might have chosen the conventional route of college, engagement, and suburban life planning, but she noticed things about people that others missed. "I'm fine," I said automatically, then paused and tried to give her a more honest answer. "It's just strange being back here. Everything's exactly the same, but I feel like a completely different person than when I left." "Different how?" she asked, and I could see genuine curiosity in her eyes. How could I explain it? How could I tell her that the awkward, uncertain brother she remembered had become someone whose daily routine involved classified briefings and security protocols? That the family disappointment had developed expertise that was valued at the highest levels of government? That I'd built a life of significance and impact that they couldn't imagine because I'd never been able to share the details that would make it real to them? "Just more confident, I guess," I said finally. "More sure of what I'm doing and why it matters." She nodded slowly, like she was processing something she couldn't quite put her finger on. "It shows," she said. "You carry yourself differently. Like you know something the rest of us don't." The observation was more accurate than she realized, and it sent a chill down my spine. I did know things they didn't, carried information and responsibility that would fundamentally change how they saw the world if they understood the scope of it. The weight of classified knowledge, the burden of working in spaces where life and death decisions were made daily, the responsibility of contributing to policies that affected millions of people, it all left marks that were apparently more visible than I'd realized. Before I could respond, Mom emerged from the kitchen carrying Dad's birthday cake, 60 candles blazing in the gathering dusk. Everyone gathered around the picnic table, singing the traditional off-key version of Happy Birthday that had marked family celebrations for as long as I could remember. Dad made a show of thinking about his wish before blowing out the candles, and everyone cheered and clapped. It was such a normal, wholesome family moment, the kind of scene that would have felt perfectly comfortable and familiar just a few years ago. But now, with Agent Mitchell positioned somewhere in the shadows beyond the fence line, and Agent Thompson maintaining communication with their support team, the innocent family celebration felt surreal. As Mom cut the cake and handed out pieces, I found myself thinking about the double life I'd been living. To my family, I was still just Alex, the disappointing son who'd chosen an incomprehensible career path and rarely came home. To my colleagues in Washington, I was someone whose analysis influenced major policy decisions, whose security clearance opened doors to information that shaped national strategy, whose protection required federal agents and careful coordination. The cognitive dissonance was becoming harder to maintain. Sitting at this familiar picnic table, surrounded by people who thought they knew me but had no idea who I'd become, I felt like I was living in two completely different worlds that had no common language or shared understanding. "This is delicious, Mom," I said, accepting a piece of cake and trying to focus on the simple pleasure of family dessert. "You still make the best chocolate cake in Riverside?" She beamed at the compliment, and for a moment everything felt normal again. Just a family celebrating a birthday, sharing cake and stories, enjoying each other's company on a warm California evening. But underneath the surface, tensions were building that none of us fully understood yet. It was Marcus who finally asked the question that changed everything. "Alex, I've been thinking about what Uncle Tony said earlier, about your work in Washington. I know you can't talk about everything you do, but I'm curious, how important is your job, really? Like, on a scale of 1 to 10, where would you put it in terms of impact and responsibility?" The question was so direct, so genuinely curious, that it caught me completely off guard. Marcus wasn't trying to dismiss or diminish my work. He was actually asking for an honest assessment of its significance, and his tone suggested he was prepared to take my answer seriously. I looked around the table at faces that were suddenly paying attention in a way they hadn't before. Even Uncle Tony had stopped eating his cake and was waiting for my response. They were finally asking the right question, the one that could bridge the gap between their perception of my life and its reality. But how do you answer honestly without revealing classified information? How do you explain the true scope and importance of your work to people who don't have security clearances? How do you convey the weight of responsibility you carry without sounding arrogant or self-important? "It's important," I said carefully, feeling the weight of everyone's attention. "More important than I can really explain without going into details I'm not allowed to share." "What kind of details?" Sophie asked, leaning forward with genuine interest. "Like, state secrets kind of stuff?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon, and I realized we'd reached the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The moment when my two worlds collided? When the careful separation I'd maintained for years finally became impossible to sustain. "Something like that," I said quietly, and watched as their expressions began to change. For the first time, I could see them starting to understand that my vague answers weren't because my work was boring or unimportant, but because it was exactly the opposite. Dad set down his fork and looked at me with an intensity I hadn't seen since I was a teenager, coming home past curfew. "Son, just what exactly do you do for the government?" It was the question I'd been avoiding for years, and as I sat there looking at faces that were suddenly taking me seriously for the first time in my adult life, I realized that everything was about to change. The careful balance I'd maintained, the protective distance I'd created, the simple family dynamics we'd all grown comfortable with, it was all about to shatter. And that's when we heard the sound that would make the shattering complete. Footsteps on the side path leading to the backyard, purposeful and professional, accompanied by the quiet murmur of radio communication. Agent Mitchell appeared at the corner of the house, her posture alert but non-threatening, her credentials visible in her hand. She'd been monitoring the situation from a distance, but something had triggered her protective instincts enough to make her presence known. The effect on my family was immediate and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, forks suspended halfway to mouths. Everyone's attention laser-focused on the serious woman in the dark suit who had just materialized in their backyard like something out of a movie. "Dr. Rivera," Agent Mitchell said, her voice carrying the kind of professional authority that commanded instant respect. "We need to speak with you briefly about a developing situation. Nothing urgent, but it requires your immediate attention." The title hit my family like a physical blow. Dr. Rivera. Not Alex. Not the family disappointment. Not the son who'd never quite measured up to their expectations. Dr. Rivera. Spoken with the kind of deference reserved for people whose time and attention mattered at the highest levels. I could see Uncle Tony's mouth actually fall open. Mom's hand flew to her chest, like she was having trouble breathing. Marcus looked back and forth between Agent Mitchell and me like he was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Sophie grabbed Derek's arm so tightly he winced, and Dad just stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, like he was looking at a stranger who happened to share his DNA. Agent Mitchell waited patiently while the shock rippled through my family, her professional composure unshaken by their obvious bewilderment. She'd been in situations like this before, I realized. She knew exactly what impact her presence would have, and she was giving them time to process the fundamental shift in their understanding of who I was and what my life actually entailed. "Of course," I said, standing up from the picnic table with the kind of calm authority I'd developed over years of high-pressure situations. "Family, this is Agent Mitchell. Agent Mitchell, this is my family." The introduction was surreal in its simplicity, but it accomplished exactly what needed to happen. It confirmed that this wasn't a case of mistaken identity or some kind of elaborate misunderstanding. The serious federal agent standing in their backyard was there for me, addressing me with a level of respect and importance that completely contradicted everything they thought they knew about my life. "Pleased to meet you all," Agent Mitchell said politely, but her attention remained focused on me. "Dr. Rivera, if we could have just a moment." I could feel my family's eyes following me as I walked toward Agent Mitchell, their shock giving way to 1,000 questions they suddenly needed answers to. Who was Dr. Rivera? What kind of work required federal agents to track you down at family birthday parties? How had their disappointing son become someone important enough to warrant this kind of attention? As Agent Mitchell and I moved out of their hearing range, I could see them starting to whisper among themselves, their voices urgent and confused. The comfortable family dinner they'd been enjoying had just been replaced by something none of them had experienced processing. And I realized, with a mixture of anticipation and dread, that there was no going back to the way things had been. The secret I'd been keeping for years, the careful separation between my family life and my professional identity, had just been shattered in the space of 30 seconds. Everything was about to change, and for the first time in my adult life, my family was going to see me exactly as I was. Not the disappointment they'd always believed me to be, but someone whose work mattered enough to require federal protection, whose expertise was valued at the highest levels of government, whose life had become something they'd never imagined possible. The validation I'd stopped hoping for was finally within reach, but it was coming in a way that would change everything about our relationship forever. Agent Mitchell's briefing was concise and professional, delivered in the clipped tones of someone accustomed to conveying critical information efficiently. There had been chatter picked up by intelligence services about potential threats to several high-level government officials, including myself. Nothing imminent, nothing that required immediate evacuation, but enough concern to warrant heightened awareness and a review of my current security posture. The threat assessment has been elevated from Code Yellow to Code Orange as of 1400 hours today, she explained, her voice low enough that my family couldn't overhear but clear enough that I understood the seriousness. "We're recommending shortened exposure times for public appearances and family gatherings. Agent Thompson has already coordinated with local law enforcement to establish a wider perimeter." I nodded, processing the information while simultaneously aware that my family was watching our conversation with fascination and growing alarm. They couldn't hear what we were discussing, but they could see Agent Mitchell's serious demeanor and my equally serious responses. The body language alone was telling them more about my life than I'd revealed in years of carefully deflective phone calls. "How long do you recommend for this gathering?" I asked, falling easily into the professional pattern of threat assessment and risk mitigation that had become second nature. "Another hour would be acceptable given the current intelligence picture," Agent Mitchell replied. "But we'd prefer to conclude within 30 minutes if possible. The longer you remain stationary in a predictable location, the higher the potential risk." The surreal nature of the conversation wasn't lost on me. Here I was, discussing threat levels and security protocols while standing in my parents' backyard, the scent of Dad's birthday cake still lingering in the evening air. The two worlds I'd kept so carefully separated were now colliding in the most dramatic way possible. "Understood," I said. "Give me a few minutes to wrap things up with my family." Agent Mitchell nodded and stepped back to her position at the perimeter, but her presence remained a constant reminder that my life operated according to rules and realities that my family had never imagined. As I walked back toward the picnic table, I could see them trying to appear casual, while straining to read every nuance of my expression. The question started before I'd even sat back down. "Alex, what the hell is going on?" Marcus's voice carried a mixture of concern and bewilderment that I'd never heard from him before. "Who is that woman? And why is she calling you Dr. Rivera?" Mom's hand was still pressed to her chest, her face pale with shock. "Are you in some kind of trouble, honey? Is this about taxes or something legal?" Uncle Tony had abandoned any pretense of casual interest. "That's a federal agent, isn't it? FBI or something like that. Alex, what kind of work do you really do?" The barrage of questions felt like an interrogation. But for the first time in my adult life, I could hear genuine concern in their voices rather than the usual mixture of polite interest and barely concealed disappointment. They were finally seeing me as someone whose life might actually matter, whose choices might have consequences beyond their ability to understand or control. "It's complicated," I said, which was both true and completely inadequate. "My work sometimes requires security measures." "Security measures?" Sophie's voice was higher than usual, edged with the kind of panic that came from realizing the world was more dangerous and complex than she'd assumed. "Alex, are you some kind of spy or something?" The question hung in the air like smoke from Uncle Tony's grill, visible and impossible to ignore. I could see Dad studying my face with the same intensity he brought to reading construction blueprints, trying to piece together information that would help him understand what his son had become. "I'm not a spy," I said carefully. "I work in analysis and policy development, like I told you. But some of that work involves classified information and national security issues." "National security?" Mom's voice was barely above a whisper. "Alex, honey, what exactly are you analyzing?" It was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating for years. The one that would require me to either lie outright or reveal information that would fundamentally change how they saw everything. The careful balance I'd maintained, the protective vagueness that had allowed me to avoid this conversation, was no longer possible with Agent Mitchell standing 20 feet away. "I analyze threats to American interests," I said slowly, choosing each word carefully, both foreign and domestic. "I help develop recommendations for policy responses to those threats." The words sounded almost mundane when I said them like that, but I could see my family beginning to understand the implications. Threats to American interests. Policy recommendations. Federal protection details. The dots were connecting in ways that painted a picture none of them had ever imagined. Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious in a way I rarely saw outside of family crises. "When you say threats to American interests, what kind of threats are we talking about?" "The kind that require security clearances to discuss," I replied, and saw him nod slowly as the full weight of that statement sank in. Uncle Tony set down his beer with a sharp clink against the picnic table. "Jesus Christ, Alex! You're talking about terrorism and foreign intelligence and all that stuff, aren't you?" I didn't answer directly, but I didn't need to. The silence was confirmation enough, and I could see the realization spreading across their faces like ripples in a pond. Their disappointing son, the one who'd never seemed to fit into their comfortable suburban world, was living a life that intersected with the kinds of global dangers they only read about in newspapers. "But why didn't you ever tell us?" Mom's voice carried a note of hurt that cut deeper than any of their previous dismissals. "All these years, we thought you were just pushing papers around some government office." "Because I couldn't tell you," I said, and for the first time I allowed some of the frustration I'd been carrying to show in my voice. "The work I do is classified. The less you know about the specifics, the safer you are." The word safer landed like a physical blow, and I could see Sophie grab Derek's hand while Mom's face went even paler. They were beginning to understand that my work wasn't just important in some abstract bureaucratic sense. It was dangerous enough to require federal protection, and serious enough to potentially put them at risk by association. Dad spoke for the first time since Agent Mitchell had appeared, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that had made him successful in the construction business. "Son, are you telling us that your work puts you in actual danger?" The direct question demanded a direct answer, and I could see that years of careful deflection and protective vagueness had brought us to this moment of truth. "Yes," I said simply. "Sometimes it does." The admission seemed to suck all the air out of the backyard. Uncle Tony stared at me like I was a stranger. Marcus ran his hands through his hair in a gesture of overwhelmed confusion, and Mom looked like she might cry. Even the kids, who had been playing near the fence throughout dinner, had gone quiet, as if sensing the gravity of the adult conversation happening nearby. "How long?" Dad asked quietly. "How long has your work been dangerous enough to require federal protection?" "A while," I said, unwilling to give specifics that might reveal more than was safe. "It's not constant, but when there are elevated threat levels, precautions are taken." "Elevated threat levels," Sophie repeated, like she was testing the words to see if they made sense. "Alex, this is insane. Why didn't you ever tell us any of this?" "Because every time I tried to explain that my work was important, you acted like I was deluding myself," I said, and immediately regretted the edge in my voice. But years of accumulated frustration were bubbling to the surface, and the careful emotional control I'd maintained was beginning to crack. "We acted like you were deluding yourself because you never told us what you actually did," Marcus shot back, his own frustration evident. "You gave us these vague answers about analysis and policy development. How are we supposed to know you were talking about national security?" "You weren't supposed to know," I said firmly. "That's the whole point of classified work. The information is compartmentalized to protect both the people who have access to it and the people who don't." Aunt Carmen, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "Alex, honey, are you saying that knowing about your work would put us in danger?" The question went straight to the heart of one of my deepest fears, the reason I'd kept such careful distance between my professional life and my family relationships. "It could," I admitted. "People who work in national security sometimes become targets, and their families can become targets by association." The words hung in the evening air like a physical presence, transforming the comfortable suburban backyard into something that suddenly felt exposed and vulnerable. I could see them all looking around with new eyes, suddenly aware that the safe, predictable world they'd always inhabited might not be as secure as they'd assumed. "But the protection," Mom said slowly, gesturing toward where Agent Mitchell maintained her professional vigil. "That means you're important enough to be worth protecting." It wasn't a question, and the tone in her voice was one I'd never heard before when she talked about my work. Not dismissive or condescending, but something approaching awe. The realization that her son wasn't just employed by the government, but was valuable enough to warrant federal protection, was recontextualizing everything she thought she understood about my life. "The government protects people whose work is critical to national security," I said carefully. "When there are credible threats, resources are allocated accordingly." Uncle Tony shook his head slowly, his expression shifting from skepticism to something like respect. "Alex, I owe you an apology. All those times I gave you grief about government work, about wasting your talents on bureaucracy. I had no idea." "You couldn't have known," I said, though part of me appreciated the acknowledgement more than I wanted to admit. "I couldn't tell you." "But you could tell us now," Sophie said urgently. "I mean, if you're already here with federal agents and everything, couldn't you explain what you actually do?" I glanced toward Agent Mitchell, who was maintaining her position but undoubtedly monitoring our conversation for any potential security breaches. "Some things, maybe. But there are limits to what I can share, even with family." The qualifications seemed to satisfy them, at least partially. They were beginning to understand that my life operated according to rules and restrictions they'd never encountered, that the vague answers I'd given over the years weren't evasions but necessary protections. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You know what's really wild about this? You've been living this completely different life, dealing with all this serious stuff, and we've been treating you like the family screw-up who couldn't figure out how to get a real job." The observation was so accurate and so painful that I didn't know how to respond. Yes, that was exactly what had been happening. While they'd been dismissing my career choices and questioning my life decisions, I'd been building expertise that was valued at the highest levels of government, contributing to policies that affected millions of people, and gradually becoming important enough to warrant federal protection. "It wasn't your fault," I said finally. "I couldn't explain what I was really doing, so you made assumptions based on what you could see." "But it must have been frustrating," Dad said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he was beginning to understand the weight of secrets I'd been carrying. "All those years, listening to us question your choices when you knew we didn't have the full picture." It was the most perceptive thing Dad had ever said about my experience, and it caught me completely off guard. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But I understood why you were confused. From your perspective, I'd moved across the country for work I couldn't explain, in a field you didn't understand, for reasons that didn't make sense." Mom reached across the table and placed her hand over mine, a gesture of maternal comfort that felt foreign after years of careful emotional distance. "Honey, I'm so sorry. All those times I called your work a phase, or suggested you come home and do something meaningful. I had no idea you were already doing something so important." The apology was unexpected and overwhelming, and I found myself struggling to maintain the professional composure that had become my default mode. This was what I'd wanted for years: recognition that my work mattered, acknowledgement that my choices had value, understanding that my life had significance beyond their ability to measure or appreciate. But now that it was happening, it felt complicated in ways I hadn't anticipated. The validation was coming because my work had been revealed to be dangerous and classified, not because they'd come to value my intelligence or trust my judgment. They were impressed by the federal protection and the security clearances, not by the analytical skills or policy expertise that had earned those privileges. "The work itself is what matters," I said carefully. "The protection and the security measures are just necessary complications. But what kind of work requires that level of protection?" Uncle Tony asked, his earlier skepticism replaced by genuine curiosity. "I mean, what are you actually working on that's important enough to warrant federal agents?" It was the question I'd been hoping to avoid, the one that would require me to either deflect again or reveal more than was probably wise. But looking around the table at faces that were finally taking me seriously, at family members who were genuinely trying to understand rather than dismiss, I found myself wanting to give them something real. "I analyze intelligence related to threats against American interests," I said slowly, "both from foreign governments and from domestic sources. I help assess the credibility of those threats and develop recommendations for how to respond to them." "Like terrorist threats?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Among other things," I confirmed. "Cyber attacks, foreign interference, economic espionage, political manipulation. The threats are more diverse and more sophisticated than most people realize." The words seemed to land with physical weight, and I could see them processing the implications. Their disappointing son wasn't just analyzing abstract policy issues. He was working to identify and counter real threats to the country's security and stability. Marcus rubbed his forehead like he was developing a headache. "Alex, this is incredible and terrifying. How do you live with this kind of responsibility?" "The same way Dad lives with the responsibility of making sure buildings don't collapse," I said. "You develop expertise, you follow protocols, you work with good people, and you do your job as well as you can." It was a comparison I'd never made before, but I could see it resonating with Dad in a way that surprised me. His work in construction involved real consequences, too. People's safety depended on his expertise and attention to detail. The scale was different, but the fundamental responsibility wasn't entirely foreign to him. "But people don't usually send federal agents to protect construction foremen," Dad said with a slight smile that was the first hint of humor he'd shown all evening. "No," I agreed. "But the principle is the same. Important work comes with responsibility. And, sometimes, with risk." Agent Mitchell's voice carried across the yard, interrupting our conversation with professional urgency. "Dr. Rivera, we need to begin wrapping up this gathering. The current threat assessment recommends limiting exposure time." The reminder brought everyone back to the immediate reality of my situation. This wasn't just an abstract discussion about career choices and family. Relationships. There were actual security concerns that required immediate attention. Of course, I said, standing up from the picnic table. I need to head back. The finality of the statement seemed to hit my family all at once. After years of distance and misunderstanding, we'd finally begun to bridge the gap between their perception of my life and its reality. But the same factors that had made this revelation possible, the classified nature of my work, the security concerns, the federal protection, were also cutting our reunion short. "When will we see you again?" Mom asked, and there was an urgency in her voice that suggested she understood this might not be a simple matter of scheduling. "I don't know," I said honestly. "It depends on a lot of factors I can't control." "But you'll stay in touch?" Sophie pressed. "More than you have been?" Now that we understand what's really going on, I looked around the table at faces that were finally seeing me clearly, at family members who were trying to process the enormous gap between their assumptions and my reality. The disappointment they'd felt about my life choices had been replaced by something like pride, but also by fear and confusion about what it all meant. "I'll stay in touch as much as I can," I promised. "But you have to understand that my ability to communicate is sometimes limited by security considerations." Dad stood up and extended his hand, a formal gesture that carried more weight than any of his previous attempts at paternal connection. "Son, I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've accomplished. I may not understand all of it, but I can see that it's important work." The handshake turned into an awkward hug, the kind of physical affection that had never come naturally to either of us, but felt necessary given the circumstances. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like Dad was seeing me as someone worthy of his respect, rather than just someone he was obligated to love. The goodbyes that followed were emotional in ways that our family gatherings had never been before. Mom hugged me tightly and whispered apologies for all the times she'd questioned my choices. Marcus clapped me on the back and said he wanted to hear more about my work when security allowed it. Sophie made me promise to call more often, even if I couldn't talk about specifics. Even Uncle Tony, who had spent years dismissing government work as a waste of talent, shook my hand with genuine respect and said he was sorry for giving me such a hard time. As I walked toward the SUV where Agent Thompson was waiting, I could feel them watching me go with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. The family disappointment they'd known for 30 years had been revealed as someone whose work was important enough to warrant federal protection, whose expertise was valued at the highest levels of government, whose life had become something none of them had imagined possible. The drive back toward LAX was quiet, Agent Mitchell maintaining professional focus while I processed what had just happened. For years, I'd lived with the frustration of being misunderstood and undervalued by the people who were supposed to know me best. Tonight, that had finally changed, but not in the way I'd ever expected. They finally understood that my work mattered, but only because external validation had forced them to see it. The federal agents, the security protocols, the classification levels, these were things they could understand and respect in ways that my actual expertise and contributions had never impressed them. It was validation, but it came with a bitter edge. They were proud of me now because other people had deemed me worth protecting, not because they'd come to value my intelligence or trust my judgment. The recognition I'd craved for years was finally mine, but it was based on symbols of importance rather than understanding of substance. As we pulled onto the freeway heading toward the airport, Agent Mitchell spoke for the first time since leaving the house. "How are you feeling about that interaction, Dr. Rivera?" It was a more personal question than she usually asked, but I appreciated her concern. "Complicated," I said honestly. "It's what I've wanted for years, but not how I wanted it to happen." She nodded thoughtfully. Family relationships are often the most difficult to navigate when your work requires this level of security. They can't understand what they're not allowed to know, but the protection measures send a message that's sometimes easier for them to process. "They're proud of me now because you're here," I said, "not because of anything I've actually accomplished." "Maybe," Agent Mitchell said, "but pride has to start somewhere. Now that they understand the stakes, they might be able to appreciate the substance in ways they couldn't before." It was a generous interpretation, and part of me hoped she was right. Maybe this revelation would open the door to a different kind of relationship with my family, one based on mutual respect rather than patient tolerance. Maybe they'd be able to see past the security measures to the actual work and expertise that had earned them. But as the familiar landscape of Southern California rolled past the SUV windows, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed in ways that couldn't be unchanged. My family finally understood that my life mattered, but they also understood that it was dangerous and classified and fundamentally separate from their world. The distance I'd maintained to protect them had been revealed as necessary rather than chosen, and while that vindicated my decisions, it also confirmed that the gap between our lives was wider than any of us had realized. They were proud of me now, but they were also afraid for me, and those emotions were likely to complicate our relationship in new ways. The validation I'd received tonight was real and meaningful, but it came with the knowledge that my family's understanding of my life would always be limited by security requirements they couldn't control. They finally saw me as successful, but success in my field meant accepting restrictions and risks that would always keep parts of my life hidden from them. As Agent Mitchell had said, family relationships were complicated when your work required this level of security. Tonight had proven that beyond any doubt. The flight back to Washington felt different than any trip I'd taken before. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of being misunderstood by my own family. But I was carrying something else now. The responsibility of being seen accurately, with all the complications that came with it. Agent Mitchell had positioned herself across the aisle, maintaining her professional vigilance, while giving me space to process what had just happened. Agent Thompson was 3 rows behind us, his presence barely noticeable to other passengers, but constantly reassuring to me. As the plane climbed through the evening sky above California, I found myself replaying every moment of the dinner conversation. The shock on Marcus's face when Agent Mitchell had called me Dr. Rivera. The way Mom's hand had flown to her chest when she realized federal agents were there for me. Uncle Tony's stammered apology for years of dismissing government work as meaningless bureaucracy. Dad's handshake that had carried more respect than any interaction we'd ever had. It was everything I'd wanted for years, but it felt hollow in ways I hadn't expected. They finally understood that my work mattered, but only because external symbols had forced them to see it. The federal protection, the classification levels, the security protocols, these were things they could recognize and respect in ways that my actual expertise and contributions never had. It was validation, but it was validation of the wrong things. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Alex, I keep thinking about tonight. I had no idea. Really want to talk more when you can. I'm proud of you, brother." Then one from Sophie. "Still processing everything. Are you safe? Can you tell us if you're safe?" And finally, one from Mom. "Honey, I'm so sorry for all the times I didn't understand. Your father and I are so proud of what you've become. Please be careful." Each message carried genuine emotion, but they also carried something I'd never heard from my family before: fear. They were proud of me now, but they were also afraid for me, and that fear was going to change our relationship in ways none of us fully understood yet. The distance I'd maintained wasn't just professional necessity anymore. It was emotional protection for people who now understood that knowing too much about my life could put them in danger. Agent Mitchell leaned across the aisle as we reached cruising altitude. "Dr. Rivera, I wanted to discuss the family security briefing we'll need to conduct." "Family security briefing?" I looked up from my phone, confused. "Standard protocol when family members become aware of a protectee's status," she explained. "They'll need basic security awareness training, communication protocols, and threat recognition guidelines. Nothing extensive, but enough to help them understand their role in maintaining operational security." The reality of what she was describing hit me like a physical blow. My family would need security training. They'd have to learn how to recognize potential threats, how to communicate safely, how to modify their daily routines to minimize risk. The simple suburban life they'd always lived was about to become complicated by considerations they'd never had to think about before. "How extensive is this training?" I asked, dreading the answer. 2 days, typically. We cover personal security awareness, digital communications safety, recognition of surveillance activities, and emergency protocols. It's designed to be thorough but not overwhelming. I tried to imagine Marcus sitting through lectures about surveillance detection and secure communication methods, or Sophie learning about digital security protocols and threat assessment, or Mom and Dad having to modify their daily routines because their son's work had made them potential targets. The mental image was both surreal and deeply troubling. When would this happen? I asked. Within the next 2 weeks, ideally. The sooner family members understand the security implications, the better protected everyone remains. Agent Mitchell was being professional and thorough, but I could see the larger implications of what she was describing. My family's revelation about my work wasn't just going to change how they saw me, it was going to change how they lived their lives. The comfortable anonymity they'd always enjoyed was about to be replaced by security awareness and threat consciousness. The remainder of the flight passed quietly, but my mind was racing with questions and concerns I'd never had to consider before. How would my family handle the reality of living with security restrictions? Would they begin to resent the complications my work brought into their lives? Would the pride they'd expressed tonight turn into frustration when they realized what it actually meant to be associated with someone in my position? Landing at Dulles felt like returning to a world that made sense, where my identity and responsibilities were clearly defined and understood. Agent Thompson retrieved our luggage, while Agent Mitchell coordinated with the local security team for transport back to my apartment. The efficiency of their coordination was comforting after the emotional complexity of the family dinner. But even in the familiar environment of Washington, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. For years, I'd compartmentalized my life successfully, keeping my family relationships separate from my professional responsibilities. That compartmentalization had just been shattered, and I wasn't sure how to rebuild it or whether it was even possible to rebuild it. My apartment overlooked the Potomac, a modern space that reflected the life I'd built in Washington. Clean lines, minimal decoration, everything designed for efficiency and security rather than comfort or nostalgia. It was the home of someone whose life operated according to different rules than most people followed, and for the first time, that reality felt isolating, rather than empowering. Agent Mitchell conducted her standard security sweep, while Agent Thompson established communication with the overnight protection detail. Their presence in my space was routine, but tonight it felt different. Instead of being a necessary professional precaution, it was a reminder of the barriers that would always exist between my life and the normal family relationships I'd glimpsed tonight. Dr. Rivera, Agent Mitchell said as she completed her security check, I'll need to coordinate the family briefing schedule with you tomorrow. Are there any particular concerns about your family's ability to handle the security requirements? It was a practical question, but it forced me to confront uncomfortable realities about the people I loved most. My parents are in their 60s, I said slowly. They've lived their entire lives in a small suburban community where the biggest security concern is remembering to lock the front door. This is going to be a significant adjustment. We'll tailor the training accordingly, Agent Mitchell assured me. But Dr. Rivera, you should know that family adjustment to security protocols is usually more successful than people expect. Once they understand the stakes, most families adapt well to the necessary precautions. Her reassurance was professional and probably accurate, but it didn't address my deeper concerns. Would my family's newfound pride in my work survive the reality of what that work required from them? Would they begin to see my success as a burden when it meant modifying their daily routines and constantly thinking about security threats? After Agent Mitchell and Agent Thompson departed for the night, leaving me in the capable hands of the overnight protection detail, I sat by my window looking out at the lights of the Capitol. For the first time in years, my family understood who I was and what I did for work. They were proud of me in ways they'd never been before, and they finally recognized the significance of my contributions to national security. But that understanding came with complications I'd never fully anticipated. They would need security training, communication protocols, and threat awareness education. Their simple suburban life was about to become more complex because their disappointing son had turned out to be important enough to warrant federal protection. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent years wanting my family to see me as successful, and now that they did, their recognition was going to require them to live differently than they ever had before. The validation I'd craved was real, but it came with costs that extended far beyond my own life. My phone rang, interrupting my brooding. The caller ID showed Rachel's name, my former girlfriend, who still worked in intelligence analysis, and who understood the demands of classified work better than almost anyone. "Alex?" Her voice was warm but concerned. "I heard through the grapevine that there was a family emergency today. Is everything okay?" "Not an emergency exactly," I said, grateful for the chance to talk to someone who would understand the complexities without requiring extensive explanation. More like a revelation. My family found out about the nature of my work. "Oh." Rachel's pause conveyed immediate understanding of the implications. "How did that happen?" I explained the evening's events, from the family dinner to Agent Mitchell's appearance, to my family's shocked realization about my actual work and status. Rachel listened without interruption, her intelligence background allowing her to grasp both the professional and personal ramifications immediately. "That's a lot to process," she said when I finished. "How are you feeling about it?" "Conflicted," I admitted. "I've wanted this recognition for years. But now that I have it, I'm not sure what to do with it. They're proud of me, but they're also afraid, and they're going to have to change how they live because of my work." "The family security briefing?" "Among other things," I confirmed. "Rachel, they're going to learn about threat assessment and surveillance detection. My mother, who worries when I don't call for 2 weeks, is going to have to learn about operational security." Rachel's laugh was sympathetic but understanding. "Alex, you're overthinking this. Yes, it's an adjustment, but families adapt. And honestly, isn't it better that they finally understand what you do, rather than continuing to think you're wasting your talents on meaningless bureaucracy?" She was right, of course. The alternative to tonight's revelation was continuing to live with my family's fundamental misunderstanding of my life and work. But knowing she was right didn't make the complications feel any less overwhelming. "The thing is," I said, "they're proud of me now because federal agents showed up at their dinner table. Not because they've come to value my judgment or trust my expertise. They're impressed by the symbols of importance, not by the substance that earned those symbols." "Maybe," Rachel said, thoughtfully. "But Alex, you've been waiting for them to understand substance they weren't allowed to know about. Now that they know the stakes, maybe they'll be able to appreciate the expertise in ways they couldn't before." It was a generous interpretation, and part of me hoped she was right. But as we continued talking, I found myself thinking about the deeper implications of what had happened tonight. My family's understanding of my work would always be limited by classification requirements they couldn't control. They would know enough to be proud and afraid, but never enough to fully comprehend what I actually did or why it mattered. After ending the call with Rachel, I tried to settle into my evening routine, but my mind kept returning to the family dinner and its aftermath. The validation I'd received was real and meaningful, but it was also incomplete in ways that might always leave me feeling partially understood. Over the next several days, the reality of my family's new awareness began to unfold in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. The phone calls came more frequently now, but they carried a different emotional weight than before. Instead of the perfunctory check-ins we'd maintained for years, they were urgent conversations driven by concern and curiosity about aspects of my life they were finally allowed to acknowledge. Mom called every morning for a week, ostensibly to check on routine matters but actually to reassure herself that I was safe. Her questions were careful and general, clearly coached by some preliminary security awareness she'd received, but her maternal anxiety was unmistakable. Marcus called wanting to know if there was anything he could do to help. Anyway, his construction business expertise might be relevant to my security needs. His offer was touching but impractical, and I found myself in the strange position of having to explain why his desire to help was appreciated but impossible to accommodate. Sophie's calls were the most difficult because they were driven by guilt about years of not taking my work seriously. She apologized repeatedly for treating my career choices as disappointing or incomprehensible, and her remorse was genuine but also exhausting to manage. Even Uncle Tony called, awkwardly trying to express respect for work he still didn't fully understand, but now recognized as important. His attempts at conversation were stilted and formal, as if he was afraid that casual discussion might somehow compromise national security. The attention was overwhelming, and I began to understand why many people in my position chose to maintain complete separation between their professional and family lives. The emotional energy required to manage their newfound awareness was significant, and it was energy I needed to focus on my actual work responsibilities. Agent Mitchell scheduled the family security briefing for the following weekend, coordinating with a team of specialists who would travel to Riverside to conduct the training at a local government facility. The logistics were complex but routine for them, just another family requiring security awareness education because of their connection to a protected individual. But for me, the upcoming briefing felt like a milestone that would permanently change my relationship with my family. Once they completed the training, they would understand the reality of living with security consciousness, and there would be no going back to the innocent suburban life they'd always known. The night before the briefing was scheduled to begin, I received a call from Dad that surprised me with its emotional directness. "Alex," he said without preamble, "I want you to know that your mother and I have been talking, and we understand that tomorrow is going to change things for us. We're ready for that. We should have been ready years ago." His acknowledgement was more insightful than I'd expected, and it revealed a level of understanding about the complexities of my situation that I hadn't given him credit for. "Dad, I'm sorry this is necessary," I said. "I never wanted my work to complicate your lives." "Son, we're proud of what you've accomplished," he replied firmly. "If learning about security protocols is the price of understanding what you do, then that's a price we're willing to pay." The conversation was brief but meaningful, and it gave me hope that my family's adjustment to the realities of my work might be more successful than I'd feared. They were approaching the security briefing with seriousness and determination rather than resentment, and that attitude would make all the difference in how well they adapted. The weekend training session was conducted by a team of 3 specialists who had extensive experience in family security education. Agent Mitchell coordinated the logistics, while the trainers worked through modules covering personal security awareness, digital communications safety, surveillance recognition, and emergency protocols. I participated remotely via secure video conference, watching my family learn about concepts that had become second nature to me but were entirely foreign to their experience. Mom took careful notes during the digital security presentation. Dad asked thoughtful questions about physical security measures. Marcus and Sophie worked together on surveillance detection exercises, treating the training with the same seriousness they'd bring to any important skill development. By Sunday evening, they had completed the basic certification and demonstrated competency in the fundamental security awareness skills. But more importantly, they had begun to understand the daily reality of living with security consciousness, and they were handling that understanding better than I'd dared to hope. The debrief session was conducted with the entire family together, reviewing key concepts and establishing ongoing communication protocols. Agent Mitchell explained the support resources available to them and the procedures for reporting any security concerns that might arise. "The most important thing to remember," she told them, "is that security awareness becomes automatic with practice. What feels complicated and overwhelming now will become routine within a few weeks." After the training concluded, I had a private video conference with my family to discuss their experience and address any concerns they might have. The conversation was different from any we'd ever had before, focused, serious, but also somehow more intimate than our interactions had been in years. "Alex," Mom said, "I want you to know that learning about all this hasn't made us more worried about you. It's made us more proud. Understanding what you do and why it requires these precautions helps us see how important your work really is." Marcus nodded in agreement. "Honestly, the training was fascinating. I had no idea how much thought went into keeping people safe. It makes me respect what you do even more." Sophie was characteristically direct. "I feel like an idiot for all those years. I thought you were just pushing papers around some boring government office. This is serious stuff, Alex. You're doing serious, important work." Even Uncle Tony, who had remained skeptical about government work for decades, seemed genuinely impressed by what he'd learned. "Alex, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you respect for work I was too ignorant to understand." Their responses were everything I'd hoped for and nothing I'd expected. Instead of being overwhelmed or resentful about the security requirements, they seemed energized by finally understanding the stakes and their role in maintaining operational security. Over the following weeks, our communication settled into new patterns that reflected their enhanced security awareness. Phone calls were more structured, but also more substantial. They asked better questions because they understood the context better, and I could give more detailed answers because they had the framework to understand them. The distance between us hadn't disappeared, but it had become functional rather than emotional. They understood why certain information couldn't be shared and why certain precautions were necessary. The security requirements that had once felt like barriers now felt like appropriate protections for work they finally recognized as vitally important. 3 months after the family dinner that changed everything, I received a promotion that elevated my security classification and expanded my responsibilities even further. The advancement came with additional protection protocols and more stringent communication restrictions. But it also came with the satisfaction of knowing that my expertise was being recognized at the highest levels of government. When I called to share the news with my family, their response was immediate and enthusiastic. They understood enough about how classification levels worked to recognize that my promotion represented significant professional achievement, and they were proud in ways that felt genuine and informed. "Alex," Dad said during our celebration call, "I want you to know that your mother and I have been bragging about you to everyone who will listen. We can't tell them details, obviously, but we can tell them that our son does important work for the national security of this country." It was a far cry from the years when they'd struggled to explain my career choices to their friends and neighbors. Now they had a story they were proud to tell, even if the details had to remain vague. The transformation in our relationship was remarkable, but it was also sobering. My family finally understood and valued my work, but only after external validation had forced them to see it differently. The federal protection, the classification levels, the security training, these had convinced them in ways that my actual expertise and contributions never had. But perhaps that was inevitable. How could they have valued work they weren't allowed to understand? How could they have appreciated expertise they couldn't witness in action? The symbols of importance that had impressed them were the only parts of my professional life they were ever going to be permitted to see. In the end, I realized that the validation I'd received was both complete and limited. My family was proud of me now, genuinely proud, but their pride was based on understanding the stakes rather than appreciating the substance. They knew my fate. Work mattered because the government protected me, not because they could evaluate my analytical skills or policy expertise directly. It was validation, but it was validation within the constraints that had always defined our relationship. They could be proud of what I'd become, but they could never fully understand how I'd become it or what it required of me day by day. Still, as I sat in my apartment overlooking the Potomac, reviewing classified briefings for the next day's meetings, I felt a sense of peace that had been missing for years. My family finally saw me as I was, not the disappointment they'd once believed me to be, but someone whose work was important enough to warrant federal protection, whose expertise was valued at the highest levels of government, whose life had become something they could be proud of, even if they couldn't fully comprehend it. The reconciliation wasn't perfect, but it was real. The understanding wasn't complete, but it was sufficient. And for the first time since I'd left Riverside all those years ago, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Not just in my professional life, but in my family as well. The distance would always be there, mandated by security requirements that none of us could control. But it was no longer an emotional distance born of misunderstanding and disappointment. It was a functional distance that protected all of us while allowing for the kind of relationship that had seemed impossible just months before. They were proud of me now, and I was proud of them for adapting to realities they'd never asked to confront. We'd all grown in ways that were painful but necessary, and we'd emerged with something better than what we'd had before. A family relationship based on mutual respect, even if it couldn't be based on complete understanding. Standing at my window that night, looking out at the lights of the Capitol where I'd built my career and my identity, I realized that I'd finally found what I'd been searching for all along. Not the perfect family understanding I'd once imagined, but something more valuable. Acceptance of who I was and what I'd chosen to become, along with recognition that the choice had been worth making. The family disappointment had become the family success story, and while the transformation had required external validation to make it visible, it was no less meaningful for that requirement. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that can only be recognized in retrospect, and sometimes the greatest achievements are the ones that require other people's testimony to become real. I was no longer the Rivera family disappointment. I was Dr. Alex Rivera, senior intelligence analyst, policy advisor, and someone important enough to warrant federal protection. My family was proud of me, I was proud of my work, and for the first time in my adult life, those two sources of pride existed in harmony rather than conflict. The validation had finally come, and it had been worth the wait. 6 months after that transformative birthday dinner, I received an invitation that would have been unthinkable during the years of family estrangement. Sophie was getting married to Derek in a ceremony that promised to be the social event of Riverside's year, and for the first time since I'd left for Washington, I wasn't just invited as an obligation. I was wanted there, genuinely wanted, by a family that finally understood who I was and what I represented. The invitation itself was a work of art, embossed cardstock with elegant calligraphy, that spoke to the kind of wedding Sophie had been dreaming about since she was 12. But tucked inside the formal invitation was a handwritten note that meant more to me than any official document I'd ever received. Alex, I can't imagine getting married without my brother there. I know your work is complicated, but please find a way to make this happen. I want to introduce Derek's family to the most important person in mine. Love, Sophie. The most important person in mine. The words hit me with unexpected force, coming from the sister who had spent years treating me as the family afterthought. The transformation in our relationship hadn't happened overnight, but it had been steady and profound since that evening, when Agent Mitchell's appearance had shattered their comfortable assumptions about my life. Planning my attendance at Sophie's wedding required coordination that would have seemed absurd to my family just months earlier, but they now understood as necessary given the realities of my work. Agent Mitchell worked with the wedding venue to conduct a security assessment, reviewing everything from guest list protocols to emergency evacuation routes. Agent Thompson coordinated with local law enforcement to establish appropriate perimeter coverage that wouldn't interfere with the celebration but would provide adequate protection. The logistics were complex, but what struck me most was my family's enthusiastic cooperation with security requirements they would once have found incomprehensible. Mom worked with the wedding planner to accommodate seating arrangements that would allow for optimal sight lines for my protection detail. Dad coordinated with the venue's management to ensure secure arrival and departure procedures. Marcus volunteered to serve as a liaison between the security team and other family members who might have questions about the protocols. Their willingness to adapt their special day to accommodate my security needs was a demonstration of respect and inclusion that moved me deeply. This wasn't grudging tolerance of inconvenient requirements. This was a family embracing whatever was necessary to ensure that I could be part of their celebration. The week before the wedding, I flew back to California with a level of anticipation I hadn't felt about a family gathering in over a decade. Instead of dreading questions about my work or deflecting dismissive comments about government employment, I was looking forward to celebrating with people who finally saw me as someone worthy of their pride and respect. The rehearsal dinner was held at Tony's Italian Bistro, the same restaurant where our family had celebrated every major milestone throughout my childhood. But this time, when Uncle Tony introduced me to Derek's extended family, his words carried genuine pride rather than apologetic explanation. "This is my nephew Alex," he said to a table full of people who had heard about the mysterious government worker but had never met him in person. "He works in national security in Washington, D.C. Can't tell you much about what he does, but I can tell you it's important enough that the federal government provides him with personal protection." The introduction was simple but effective, establishing my credentials without revealing classified details. Derek's relatives asked polite questions about Washington and government work, but their tone was respectful rather than skeptical. They understood that they were meeting someone whose life operated according to different rules than their own, and they treated that reality with appropriate gravity. During the rehearsal itself, I found myself observing the family dynamics with new appreciation for how much had changed. Marcus, who had always been the unquestioned family favorite, now included me in conversations about important matters in ways he never had before. When Derek's father asked about family business interests, Marcus made a point of explaining that while he and Dad ran Rivera Construction, I served the country in a different but equally valuable capacity. Sophie was radiant in the way that brides always are, but she was also different in how she related to me. Instead of the casual dismissal that had characterized our interactions for years, she sought out my opinions and included me in decisions about wedding details. When her friends asked about her family, she spoke about her brother in Washington with unmistakable pride, describing my work in general terms that conveyed its importance without compromising security. Even the other wedding guests seemed to treat me differently than they would have in the past. Word had spread through Riverside's social networks about the federal agents who had appeared at the Rivera family birthday dinner, and while the details remained vague, the basic message was clear. Alex Rivera had become someone important enough to warrant government protection. The wedding ceremony itself was beautiful, a traditional Catholic service that reflected both families' values and Sophie's romantic vision. I sat in the front row next to Mom and Dad, surrounded by cousins and aunts and uncles who had known me since childhood but were seeing me with adult eyes for the first time. When the priest asked if anyone had objections to the union, Uncle Tony actually whispered, "I object to Alex not visiting more often," which earned quiet chuckles from relatives who understood that joking about my absence was now affectionate rather than critical. During the reception, I found myself in conversations that would have been impossible during my years as the family disappointment. Derek's father, a successful businessman who owned several car dealerships, asked thoughtful questions about economic policy and international trade relationships. His mother, a retired teacher, wanted to understand how my analytical work contributed to educational security initiatives. Derek's brother, who served in the military, engaged me in discussions about intelligence coordination that skirted the edges of classification restrictions but demonstrated genuine professional respect. These weren't the polite but dismissive conversations I'd endured at family gatherings for years. These were substantive discussions with people who recognized that I possessed expertise worth engaging with. The difference was remarkable and deeply satisfying. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came during the traditional father-daughter dance, when Dad surprised everyone by asking if he could say a few words to the assembled guests. Public speaking had never been his strength, but he stood up with the microphone and delivered remarks that left me struggling to maintain my composure. "My daughter Sophie has always been the light of our family," he began, looking directly at the bride with obvious love and pride. "But tonight I want to talk about the strength of our family, which comes from all of our children pursuing their own paths and making their own contributions to the world." He paused, his eyes finding me in the crowd. "My son Alex chose a path that took him far from home and into work that we didn't understand for many years. We thought he was just different, maybe a little too serious, maybe too focused on things that didn't seem to matter to the rest of us." The room was quiet now, guests recognizing that this was more than typical father of the bride sentiment. Dad continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "What we learned recently is that Alex wasn't just different. He was building something important. He was developing expertise that serves our country in ways that require sacrifice and dedication most people never have to make. The work he does keeps all of us safer, even when we don't know it, even when we can't understand the details." Dad raised his glass and I could see tears in his eyes. "So tonight, while we celebrate Sophie and Derek starting their new life together, I also want to celebrate Alex for the life he's built in service to something bigger than himself. We're proud of all our children, but we're especially proud of the son who taught us that success comes in many forms, and sometimes the most important work is the work that can't be celebrated publicly." The applause that followed was genuine and sustained, but what moved me most was seeing Sophie crying happy tears as she applauded, and Mom wiping her eyes while she smiled at me with unmistakable maternal pride. This was the recognition I'd craved for years, delivered not because I'd demanded it, but because they had finally come to understand it themselves. After the formal reception concluded, the family gathered for the traditional after-party at Mom and Dad's house. It was a smaller, more intimate celebration that included only the closest relatives and a few longtime family friends. Agent Mitchell and Agent Thompson maintained their professional vigil from appropriate distances, but their presence felt natural, rather than intrusive to a family that had learned to accommodate security requirements as part of loving someone whose work required protection. During the quieter moments of the evening, I found myself in one-on-one conversations with family members that revealed how profoundly our relationships had shifted. Marcus pulled me aside to apologize not just for years of not understanding my work, but for years of not trying to understand it. "Alex, I realize now that I was so focused on what I thought success looked like, that I couldn't see the success you were actually building," he said. "I kept waiting for you to come home and join the family business, because that was the only kind of achievement I could recognize. I'm sorry for being so narrow-minded." His apology was genuine and thoughtful, but what impressed me most was his recognition that the failure hadn't been mine for choosing an unconventional path, but his for refusing to expand his definition of valuable work. It showed a level of personal growth that made me optimistic about our future relationship. Sophie's conversation was different but equally meaningful. She wanted to understand not just what I did for work, but how I had developed the strength to pursue it despite years of family skepticism. "Alex, I keep thinking about all those times we made you feel like you didn't belong," she said. "How did you keep believing in yourself when none of us believed in what you were doing?" It was a perceptive question that forced me to reflect on the psychological journey I'd traveled, from family disappointment to respected professional. "I think I had to learn the difference between being understood and being valued," I said finally. "I wanted your understanding, but when I couldn't get that, I had to find my value in the work itself and in the recognition of people who could evaluate it properly." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "That must have been lonely." "Sometimes," I admitted, "but it also made me stronger. When you can't rely on external validation, you have to develop internal confidence. And that internal confidence became the foundation for everything else I built." Our conversation continued late into the evening, covering topics we'd never discussed before. The challenges of choosing unconventional careers, the importance of perseverance in the face of criticism, the value of work that serves purposes larger than individual success. It was the kind of sibling relationship I'd always hoped we could have, but had never quite achieved. Even Uncle Tony sought me out for a private conversation that would have been unthinkable during my years as the family disappointment. He wanted to apologize not just for dismissing government work, but for failing to recognize that my analytical nature and attention to detail were strengths rather than personality flaws. "Alex, I spent years telling you that you thought too much, that you were too serious, that you needed to lighten up and be more like everyone else," he said. "Now I understand that thinking deeply and taking things seriously were exactly the qualities that made you good at what you do. I'm sorry for trying to change the very things that made you successful." His apology was particularly meaningful because it acknowledged that my personality traits hadn't been obstacles to overcome but assets to develop. The characteristics that had made me seem different and difficult in family settings had been essential qualifications for my professional success. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, I found myself alone with Mom and Dad in their kitchen, the same space where we'd had countless conversations over the years, but never one quite like this. They wanted to understand not just my current work, but the journey that had led me to it. "Alex," Mom said, "I keep thinking about all those times I worried that you were wasting your intelligence on work that didn't seem to lead anywhere. I realize now that I was measuring your progress against markers that didn't apply to what you were actually building." Dad nodded in agreement. "Son, I spent years thinking that real work meant physical work, that you could only measure success by things you could see and touch. But your work produces results that are just as real, even if they're not visible in the same way. Their recognition of the fundamental difference between their work and mine was profound. Construction produced buildings that everyone could see and appreciate. Intelligence analysis produced security that no one noticed when it worked properly. Both were valuable, but the value operated according to completely different metrics. I don't need you to understand every detail of what I do, I told them. But I do need you to trust that it matters, even when you can't see the results directly. We trust that, Dad said firmly. And we're proud of you for sticking with it even when we didn't understand or support what you were doing. The conversation concluded with hugs that felt different from any physical affection we'd shared before. Instead of the obligatory embraces of family duty, these were expressions of genuine respect and love between people who finally understood each other's value. The flight back to Washington the next morning felt like a conclusion to a chapter of my life that had been painful but necessary. For years, I'd carried the burden of being misunderstood by the people whose opinions mattered most to me. That burden had been lifted not through dramatic confrontation or emotional manipulation, but through the simple process of truth being revealed and accepted. Agent Mitchell, who had observed the family dynamics throughout the wedding weekend, offered her professional assessment as we settled into our seats for the cross-country flight. "Dr. Rivera, I've worked with dozens of families during security transitions, and I have to say that your family's adaptation has been exceptional," she said. Most families struggle much more with the adjustment to security awareness and the limitations it places on communication. Why do you think our transition was smoother? I asked, genuinely curious about her professional perspective. I think it's because they were ready to understand, she replied thoughtfully. They'd reached a point where they knew something was missing from their picture of your life, and when the truth was revealed, it filled in gaps they'd been sensing for years. Her observation was insightful and probably accurate. My family's willingness to embrace the reality of my work hadn't come from nowhere. It had grown from years of accumulating evidence that their assumptions about my life didn't quite add up. My reluctance to discuss specifics, my careful responses to direct questions, my obvious competence despite their inability to understand its application, all of these had created a foundation of curiosity that made the revelation more acceptable than shocking. Over the following months, our family relationships continued to evolve in positive directions. Phone calls became more frequent and more substantial, with conversations that reflected their new understanding of my work's importance and constraints. They asked better questions because they had better frameworks for understanding my answers, and I could provide more detailed responses because they had the security awareness to handle sensitive information appropriately. The most significant change was the elimination of the subtle pressure I'd felt for years to justify my life choices. Instead of conversations that implied I should consider more conventional career paths, our discussions focused on supporting the path I'd chosen and celebrating its successes. When I received promotions or recognition, they understood the significance in ways they never had before. When my work required travel or communication restrictions, they accepted those limitations as necessary rather than personal slights. Perhaps most importantly, they had become advocates for my work in their own social circles. When friends or neighbors asked about their son who worked for the government, they spoke with genuine pride about my contributions to national security. They couldn't provide details, but they could convey the importance and complexity of what I did in ways that generated respect rather than puzzlement. The transformation in our family dynamics reached its culmination about a year after Sophie's wedding, when I received a presidential appointment to a senior advisory position that represented the pinnacle of achievement in my field. The appointment required Senate confirmation and came with a level of recognition that was both professionally gratifying and personally meaningful. When I called to share the news with my family, their response was immediate and enthusiastic. They understood enough about government structure to recognize that presidential appointments represented extraordinary professional achievement, and their pride was unmistakable. "Alex," Dad said during our celebration call, "I want you to know that your mother and I have been telling everyone who will listen that our son has been appointed to serve at the highest levels of government. We can't explain all the details, but we can explain that you've been chosen for work that will affect the entire country." Mom's voice was thick with emotion. "Honey, I'm so proud of how far you've come and how much you've accomplished. I'm also proud of how patient you were with us while we learned to understand what you were building." Their recognition felt complete in ways I had never expected to experience. They understood the significance of my achievements, they valued the contributions I was making, and they had become genuine supporters rather than skeptical observers of my career choices. Standing in my apartment overlooking the Potomac that evening, preparing for work that would now operate at the highest levels of government, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from family disappointment to presidential appointee. The external validation was gratifying, but the internal satisfaction was even more meaningful. I had built a career of genuine significance, contributing to policies and decisions that affected millions of people and helped keep the country safe. I had developed expertise that was valued by the most senior officials in government and had earned recognition that most people in my field could only dream of achieving. But perhaps most importantly, I had maintained my integrity throughout the process. I hadn't compromised my values to gain acceptance, hadn't changed my fundamental nature to fit other people's expectations, hadn't abandoned my principles to achieve conventional success. I had remained true to myself while building something of lasting value, and that authenticity had ultimately been recognized and celebrated by the people whose opinions mattered most to me. The family disappointment had become the family's greatest success story, but the transformation hadn't required me to become someone different. It had required my family to expand their understanding of what success could look like, and to recognize value in forms they hadn't previously appreciated. As I prepared for sleep that night, I felt a sense of completion that had been missing from my life for years. The professional recognition was meaningful, the family acceptance was deeply satisfying, and the knowledge that I was contributing to something larger than myself provided a sense of purpose that made all the struggles worthwhile. I was no longer fighting to prove my worth or struggling to gain recognition for work that others couldn't understand. I was simply doing important work for people who valued it, supported by a family who finally understood what I had always known, that some of the most important contributions are the ones that can't be measured by conventional standards, and some of the greatest achievements are the ones that require other people's testimony to become visible. The validation had been worth waiting for, and the journey to achieve it had made me stronger, more confident, and more committed to the work that had always been my true calling. Standing in my apartment that night, looking out at the lights of the Capitol where I had built my career and my identity, I knew that I had finally found the perfect balance between professional achievement and personal fulfillment. The family dinner that had changed everything was now just a memory, but its effects continued to ripple through every aspect of my life. My family was proud of me, I was proud of my work, and for the first time in my adult life, those two sources of pride existed in perfect harmony. The transformation was complete, and it had been worth every moment of struggle that had preceded it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.